Guys, you know I got to give you the YouTube spiel, right? If you enjoy the video, please like, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be pumping out way more content here soon. Even drop a comment down below. I love hearing from you guys. And if you feel so inclined, maybe even share the video with someone else you may think would enjoy it. I appreciate you guys watching, and thank you for taking a closer look with us. Very early on, it seems that Jesus's early followers had a high view of Jesus. Like very early on, they already thought of Jesus as an exalted figure who participated in the divine identity or in some way was God himself. Um, okay, so I think, well, obviously, the best place to start would be with Jesus himself. So, Dr. Evans, can you explain where the term Son of Man comes from? And what the significance is of Jesus constantly using it to refer to himself?
Yeah, the Son of Man figure that Jesus alludes to is from Daniel chapter 7. Frankly, I'm a little puzzled why so many scholars for the last 100 years have been slow to recognize that. Possibly they don't like the apocalyptic associations that come with it. I'm not sure. But and then some people make a big deal out of how it's it's a definite article. The Greek text literally reads the Son of the Man. And so Jesus isn't a title. He's not talking about a technical figure. He's not even talking about a messianic figure or a messianic title. He's referring to the specific person, that specific passage in Daniel 7, where a human being, one like a son of man, which is how the Aramaic and the Greek actually read, one like a son of man comes with the clouds. He comes either on the clouds, which could be significant, implying the clouds are his throne, or he comes with them. In any case, he's presented to the Ancient of Days. Presumably, he's invited to sit on one of the thrones, plural, thrones that have been set up. So I'm describing Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 14. In 14, we're told the Son of Man is given kingdom, authority, and power. So Jesus is referring to that passage. And he will then appeal to it that as Son of Man, he has authority to forgive sins. Or the Son of Man will come, he will be seated at the right hand. Caiaphas, the high priest, will see him. Caiaphas just blows up. He says it's blasphemy. And the same Son of Man figure, quite apart from Christianity, outside of Christianity, but in Jewish speculation, is seen as a divine figure who sits on God's throne. Actually, not just at God's right, but sometimes on God's throne and acts as God. And this leads to controversy in rabbinic literature. And we call it the two powers in heaven controversy. So this is powerful stuff. And Jesus sees himself as that Son of Man. And in my opinion, that's what triggers high Christology. And when the early church got to see Jesus or understanding better his own disciples, in the aftermath of the resurrection, Paul's own experience, there's no question we're talking about divinity here and not simply a prophet or some teacher that's gifted, but somebody, we need to talk about him as divine.
Sure. So is this something that scholars pretty much universally agree that Jesus did refer to himself as the Son of Man? Because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It's in Mark, it's in Matthew, it's in Luke, it's in the Q material. So it's in all the earliest sources. Is this something that like all scholars agree, like Jesus did refer to himself this way?
Yeah, I think that's now universally agreed on. There was a time when some tried to dismiss it. And of course, the counter to that kind of skepticism is, well, if it's invented, if the post-Easter church has Jesus refer to himself as the Son of Man, then why didn't the post-Easter church exploit that? You don't have a Son of Man Christology developing in post-Easter literature.
Mm-hmm.
And so and people saw that, go, yeah, you're right. It must be the way Jesus talked about himself. And you don't have a Son of Man Christology in the post-Easter church because that doesn't make any sense in the Greek and Latin speaking worlds, that is the Greeks and the Romans. So instead they talk about Jesus as Son of God. Son of Man wouldn't make any sense to a Greek or Latin person because, every Greek and Latin person would say, well, I'm the son of my father. He's a man. What are you saying? That doesn't make any sense to me. But it's an idiom in Aramaic. It's a way of saying immortal. And so again, to go back to Daniel, Daniel meant to say was he saw coming on or with the clouds one that looked like a human. And this human approached the throne of God and received authority and power. And if we add Psalm 110 to this, he is invited to sit at the right hand. So he's sharing God's divine authority in heaven. And there are plenty of non-Christian texts, Jewish texts, that envision the same thing. So that's why there's no need to see it as a post-Easter development. It's pre-Easter. It's actually pre-Jesus. And so Jesus is claiming to step into the shoes of this figure, this human figure that is more than just a human in Daniel 7. And this figure contributes to all sorts of speculations about who exactly rules heaven and what's happening, in heaven above.
Right. What is the view of the Son of Man, in your opinion, in Enoch? Is he also an exalted divine figure? Because I know some people have speculated that the Son of Man in Enoch, well, it's Enoch himself.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, later Enochic tradition does see it that way, the Metatron figure and so on. But in the actual first Enoch, if you want to call it that, the original book of Enoch, written in Aramaic, translated in Greek, only partially surviving in Greek, just some Aramaic fragments, about 20 fragmentary scrolls from Qumran in Aramaic, and then the whole thing, the whole shooting match in Ethiopic, several manuscripts in Ethiopic that survive. And remember, when we talk about the book of Enoch, we're really talking about an Enochic collection. It isn't just, the book and that's it, all 108 chapters. We're really talking about chapters 37 to 71. It's called the book, chapters 1 to 36, Book of the Watchers, chapters 37 to 71, the similitudes, the parables. And that's where the Son of Man figure shows up repeatedly. He's called the Messiah. He's called the elect one. There's talk of him sitting on the throne of God. Kings are brought before him in fear and trembling and bow before him. This part of Enoch, we don't know when it was written. Most say probably the last 2 or 3 decades of the 1st century BC. So in other words, it's a rather newish part of the Enochic cycle during the time of Jesus's ministry. And I would say Jesus himself is a witness to this way of understanding the Son of Man figure in Daniel. So in 2 independent traditions, both Jewish, Jesus and the similitudes of Enoch, you get this idea that the Son of Man figure in Daniel, he basically is divine and shares God's divine power and authority. He reigns in heaven. He sits on a throne. He will judge the world, judge rulers.
All right, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. I was listening to a video. It was an interview of Bart Ehrman interview, and the interviewer asked him, "Well, did Jesus claim to be divine?" And he brought up the whole Son of Man thing, and Dr. Ehrman said, "Yes, he's the Son of Man, for example, is given authority to forgive sins, but so are the priests, and so are the disciples. So why? I guess my question is, why does it mean that he's God just because he's given authority to do certain things by God?"
Yeah. Well, I think there's a little bit of a semantic misunderstanding. If anybody can forgive sins, then what Jesus says isn't particularly controversial. I mean, you say, well, after all, the priests forgive sins. There's a difference between being the one who forgives the sins and announcing that one's sins have been forgiven.
True.
And of course, that is an interesting semantic point. If all we had was Mark 2 healing the paralyzed man and Jesus saying to him, your sins are forgiven, well, that would be ambiguous. And I would have to agree with Bart Ehrman on that point. But what Jesus says is that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. That changes the picture. The high priest Caiaphas or his father-in-law Annas, they can't say that. They can't say, well, I'm the Son of Man figure in Daniel 7, and I've been given authority, and among other things, I can forgive sin. That's going a bit beyond that. Now, again, if we didn't have anything else to go on, it might still be up in the air, but it's not the only passage. Jesus talks about Son of Man elsewhere. He talks about being seated at the right hand of God himself. Caiaphas reacts as we should expect him to react. If he thinks Jesus is nothing more than an ordinary man, a troublemaker, sort of a prophet, kind of a teacher, but otherwise nothing more than that, then I can understand him shouting and screaming and saying blasphemy and tearing his robes when he says, I'm going to be seated at the right hand of God. And I think Caiaphas understands the allusion to Daniel 7. He understands how Daniel 7 is being talked about, as we see in the similitudes of Enoch, a very influential collection of material in the first century and beyond. So I think they're reacting to a lot more of, hey, you're presumptuous, only priests forgive sins. They recognize that, no, he's acting as God himself and saying your sins are forgiven.
Is there something within Second Temple Judaism that sort of makes it impossible to share things with God, like authority and the power to forgive sins, without actually being God?
Well, it's complicated. The last time we talked, I think I brought up Philo, and he talks about the word as a second God. For rabbinic Jews later in rabbinic Judaism, that would be scandalous. And so we need to guard against taking the monotheism of rabbinic Judaism of the 4th, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries and then running it back into the first century as though it were normative.
Right.
And I don't think there's anything heretical about what Philo was saying. That was an acceptable way of talking. And so you see it in the Targums, the Aramaic paraphrases, where the word, the memra of God, is in some sense God and acts in some sense almost independently of God, not contrary, of course, but in concert, as though he's a hypostasis or personification. So these kinds of ideas were in the air in the first century BC and the beginnings of the first century. And so for Jesus to talk about possessing in himself divine authority, we're going to go on and talk about a Qumran text, or I think that's exactly, in fact, there are a couple of at least 2 Qumran texts that see persons that are identified as not exactly God the Father and yet acting as though they are. And they have God's power and authority to do all sorts of things. And so I think Jesus is tapping into a recognized stream of tradition, which is not to say it's uncontroversial, but he's tapping into a stream of tradition. And as he continues to heal, as he commands the winds and the waves, as he casts out a whole legion of evil spirits, as he talks about forgiving sins, everything he does, he can do it. And I think that's what brings the disciples to suspect that he's no ordinary rabbi or ordinary prophet. And of course, the resurrection then, is like icing on the cake. And that's why they go out and begin using Yahweh texts in the Old Testament and applying those texts to Jesus himself.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a perfect segue into the Qumran texts. You have 11Q Melchizedek, which